Hearty shalom to all of you, whoever you are. Of course, there's no way I can know that, save the fact that you are someone with an interest in the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And kudos to you for your interest in Scripture, and appreciate your interest in it from a decidedly Messianic Jewish perspective, thus the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute. What we have on the menu in this 16-part series is to look at Isaiah. And I'm working with subtitles here, The Man, the Message, and the Messiah. And let me just tell you that by virtue of your setting your gaze to Isaiah with me, we're looking at an entrance point for many, many, many Jewish believers. The reason why I say that is just in the course of a career in ministry, in Jewish-related ministries, in talking to Jewish believers and being one myself, if you put the question out there, what was it more than anything that kind of got your heart and head looking toward Jesus? And it seems that Isaiah has been a gateway. An organization, Jews for Jesus, did a survey of Jewish believers in Jesus and wondering how they got there. It might interest you to note that there are professional grade individuals specifically bent on helping Jewish people come to know Jesus. There were the better part of 1,000 respondents to a survey that Jews for Jesus did, and it turned up that only 4% of Jewish believers at that time had had any contact with any professional missionary to the Jews kind of person. The better part of Jewish people who had come to faith were brought to a congregation on the arm of a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, a relative through marriage or what have you. And the net result is that they had tasted something and they liked what they felt. Not only that, if the question is put out there, is there a text that seems to mean more to you than any? Is there one particular document in the Bible that it seems the Lord has gotten more utility out when it comes to helping people come to know the Lord, Jewish people? And it seems that Isaiah has gotten an inordinate amount of utility. Not only Isaiah generally, but the 53rd chapter particularly is oft employed. Not only does it resonate with modern Jews that engage the text and see a story that looks akin to the Jesus story therein, but even in the New Testament itself, ancient Jewish believers, in offering a telling of the Jesus story, proof text Jesus' experience by hearkening to Isaiah 53 on a number of occasions, and we'll consider that later. What I'm looking to do here at the outset is simply to introduce you to Isaiah at the first, the man, the message overall, and then the Messiah, emphasis Messiah. In the first segment after this intro, I'll look more decidedly at the man, because there's a story there in Kings and Chronicles that in effect chronicles his rise and his experiences, that which serves as a backdrop to his own coming into his own. And I think it's great to explore that. I always personally, as a theologian, am game to explore the text within its context. That's just really important to me, so I always drag people through that. So we'll do that at the outset, and then having looked something about the man, his rise, then we'll consider his times and his message to people that are living in those times, and his pointing beyond those times, hence a following treatment of Isaiah and something of an overview. And then we'll settle down for the better part of our mini course here, and we'll just work through biblical texts. I have chosen a number of passages. It doesn't exhaust all the possibilities in Isaiah. Of course, this is just introductory in nature anyway, but you're going to want to, and you really feel it at the third and fourth segments here all the way through. You really feel the need. The only way to really do business with me is to have an open Bible in hand, because I want to take you to texts, lift them out. We'll call them pericopes. Now, that's a word that's employed when you're looking at a swatch of literature and lifting it out and examining it. That text can be referred to as a pericope. What we'll do is we'll look at various pericopes or different passages and explore the text, the context, the implications, how Messianic vision is cast through that literature. We'll consider how Jews see it who don't believe in Jesus and how Jews see it who do consider Jesus. We're all about wanting to explore this from different angles. And what we're exploring is Isaiah, employed the better part of 411 times in the New Testament, if you can imagine that. So it's not just that I think it's important, or it's not just that, I happen to think that Isaiah presages Jesus in different ways. Never mind what I think, Jeffrey Seif can drop dead. There's evidence in the New Testament that the New Testament thinks Isaiah is important, so if the New Testament authors do, so should you. Not only that, as I'd said, in modern missions and modern outreach to Jewish people, Isaiah is just the go-to source book, it seems. That's like the major gateway. Getting Isaiah in front of Jewish people and exploring it and looking at how Isaiah points to Yeshua, points to Jesus. Friends, that's a story worth telling. And never mind me telling it. You're good to go for you to tell it. But before you get the story out, you got to get the story straight. So it's my job to be a tour guide to straighten you out, to straighten out the issues a little bit. The word orthodox comes from the word orthos in Greek, which means straight, and doxology, praise, straight praise. What it is we want to look at Isaiah through a prism of an Orthodox Christian understanding of a Messianic Jewish telling of that story, and see how Isaiah can help us understand Jesus, Yeshua. So let me just get to my notes a little bit here and see if we can dig a little deeper in this introductory session here to give you some sense of where we're looking to go. As the title informs, herein we're going to survey Isaiah. And let me just say on the front end that it's a survey, because there's no way to really do justice to Isaiah in 16 little half-hour segments. With the first being an introduction, the last is a wrap-up. Basically, we're looking at 14 segments. We're looking at 7 hours, give or take a minute or two, worth of instruction on Isaiah. Now, that's a lot at one level, but your garden variety seminary class, a 3-credit-hour seminary class can be 48 class hours. So there'd be more. And even then, a 3-hour class on Isaiah could just be introductory in nature. In fact, anytime I ever teach a Bible study, I always say it's introductory. This one's really introductory. But even the ones that are more expansive, it's introductory. But herein we're going to survey Isaiah. Just introduce, just fly over the texts and dabble in it some to give some sense. So, hopefully I can be something of a professional grade tour guide to take you to and through it. But we're flying. By virtue of the exposure, we want to come to terms with the man Isaiah, as I'd said, a man, fascinating man. These men in biblical days, just like men today, come from all kinds of places. I mention that because Isaiah arguably is cut from some royal cloth himself. He's related to kings. That's why it's easier for him to be a court preacher. He's able to, have access to the corridors of power. There's some ministers, it seems the Lord gives opportunity to do that. In my generation, Billy Graham's noted for that. Every president wants to talk to him. Gee, none of them want to talk to me. And, in terms of what we believe, there's not a lot of difference between me and Billy Graham. But it seems that some of us, rise to national prominence, and the rest of us are just regular people. Well, the truth be known, even those who rise to national prominence are just regular people. At the end of the day, we come out of our mother's womb, we make our journey from the womb to the tomb, and then we, like the humans before us, return to dust to get our rewards on the other side of the grave. But it seems that on this side of the grave, some of us have more opportunities. And I mention that because Isaiah was one of those prophets, one of the few that had access to the corridors of power. There's some relationship, there's some kindredness there, as per Jewish understanding of the man. Reminds me, if you will, of Pat Robertson, who he himself is cut from Virginian aristocracy, had gone to Yale University to get his law degree, has a senator in his family. So he's cut from the purple, from the royal cloth, if you will. And it doesn't surprise me, or it didn't anyway, that he would then make a bid to run for president. It was a failed bid, but nevertheless, when I looked at Pat in his prime, there's this political component to what he's all about. It comes natural for someone like him, not for someone like me that has none of that background. Isaiah had that background. He had a contemporary, by the way, Micah, who was more of your garden variety, humble, field hand kind of prophet, kind of like me, nothing big to speak of. It's interesting, by the way, that Micah and Isaiah, there's shared verbiage. It's almost like Micah is borrowing something from Isaiah and then sharing it with his constituents, or could be, on the other hand, that Isaiah is borrowing from Micah and sharing it with his. In any case, there's some relationship between the two, and I just serve that up to say, on the one hand, here's this guy Isaiah, this noteworthy, this person who has access to the corridors of power, and then there's someone that has access to the small towns and villages, Micah. Let me just say as an aside, while there's benefits to having access to the corridors of power, there's downsides to that. And why do I say that? Because if they don't like you in the village, they just spit on you and they throw you out. If they don't like you in the palace, they saw you in too. I shouldn't laugh. That's how Isaiah finished up. Isaiah serves under the administration of a few kings, the last of which, Manasseh, according to Jewish tradition, is going to kill Isaiah. And by the way, when we get into Isaiah's message, you'll understand why a little bit. Because that old boy never read the book, How to Make Friends and Influence People. Isaiah can be very straightforward, very draconian, very harsh. And sometimes, tough times call for tough speech. And you'll see that Isaiah didn't mince words. Well, Hezekiah's son Manasseh wasn't mincing a response when he sawed him in two. You might recall the author in Hebrews. Chapter 11 says that, when going back to Old Testament noteworthies, he says that, quote, some were sawn in two, arguably a reference to Isaiah, though the Old Testament doesn't record anybody being sawn in two, but Jewish history does. Isaiah, the understanding is that when he was sawed in two, he wasn't sawed this way, but rather a log was hollowed out, he was put in it, and he was sawed in two, starting here, going up. Kind of nasty, isn't it? Yes, it is. And Manasseh, a king of Judah, if you can imagine that, was the culprit. So when some people get mad at you, they just spit on you and throw you out. Others, when you're the king, you do whatever you want. And so there was trouble there. In any case, fascinating person, this Isaiah. I like to consider the man. I like to consider his message for the time. The reason why I say that is Isaiah was an 8th century prophet. 8th century BC. He didn't get in trouble. He didn't make people mad because he was talking about Jesus who was going to come, hundreds of years later. The reason why he invoked such ire was because of the way he was construed when he dealt with issues of his day. Now, oftentimes, and understandably so, people that are interested in Jesus, like I am, Jesus, Yeshua, I don't care what kind of language you use, oftentimes, the only interest we have in the Old Testament is to go back to the Old Testament and kind of sort of want to figure out how the Old Testament points ahead to the New Testament. And, beyond that, we want to know what the Old Testament says about Jesus. And that's a very important question. But sometimes in the process of working with that question, we don't have any interest in what the Old Testament is saying in its own day and time. Because, Christian people go, well, that's Jewish days and Jewish time. What does that have to do with me? But Messianic Jewish believers, we really, we shouldn't be making that same mistake. That we should want to pay more attention to the text in its context. What's God saying to the Jewish people through the prophets to the Jews that relates to them, that relates to the future? And the reason why I say that in Isaiah, in addition to Isaiah casting a vision for a Messianic Redeemer, Isaiah casts a vision for the redemption of the nation state, of the people group, of the real estate. There's this inextricable relationship between God's love for the Jewish people, inalienable rights to the land, the territories, what God's going to do there. And so while there's value indeed in wanting to go back and look at Isaiah and put the question, how does Isaiah relate to the Messiah? That's a very important question. And by the way, we will be principally occupied with that question. But a more deliberate and careful treatment of Isaiah shouldn't be just occupied with that question, important as it is. We want to understand not just how Isaiah relates to the ultimate Jew who would come, that is Jesus, but we want to know what Isaiah says about the Jewish people collectively, Jewish experience. What's the word? What was the word to them then? Why did certain people get upset? How does it relate to Jews tomorrow? I mean, that's a question worth wrestling with whenever we read the Bible. Well, we want to come to terms with the man, his message, and his messianic vision noted therein. Isaiah casts a vision for things to come. And by the way, when the times they are changing and when the times are deplorable, it's good to do some future think, to look ahead. It seems that Isaiah was particularly game to do that. And it's in his future think, it's in his future speak, it's in his casting a vision for the world beyond the miserable. This is where we're going to find messianic passages. I think personally that it's better to light candles than it is to curse the darkness. Some people just go around cursing the darkness. You know, they're just, well, here's what's wrong with this person and that, this church, that congregation, this reverend, this rabbi, this human being. And it's all they do. And they think they're prophetic. Maybe a little prophetic, maybe a little pathetic too. You know, there's no great merit in just saying what's wrong with the world. Though if you're working in a prophetic gift, you know, you've got to call the kettle black when it's black. You know, I don't want to mince words or wince away from calling an ace and a spade, but prophecy doesn't just break down. Prophecy builds up. Hence, it's not just destructive. Well, you know what's wrong with you? It's constructive. Hey, you know what's right with you and what can be right with you? Isaiah lived in troubled times, and you're going to get some sense of that, the more so after this introductory lecture. He really did live in troubled times, but he wasn't just a troubled soul in troubled times. He looked beyond the trouble, out of the rubble. He looked to things to come. There's this future visioning, and we find messianic prophecy in all of that, as you'll see. Beyond our brief consideration of the messenger and message, the better part of this mini-course will focus on how Isaiah speaks to, for, and about Israel's Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. And at the end of the day, you know, we are ministers of the gospel, the good news. By the way, you'll see how Isaiah is very explicit in referring to the good news. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of those who proclaim good news. The most famous messianic passage in Isaiah is the 53rd chapter that is just employed by the synoptic gospels to explain Jesus, his death, his burial, his resurrection. I mean, Isaiah 53 is proof text. It's interwoven into the New Testament Calvary narratives. In the 52nd chapter, the prophet speaks about the good news of, you know, how beautiful are the feet of those who proclaim the good news. You know, our evangeline, our gospel. We, though the theologian in me wants to explore the man, as we'll do in the very next session, and the message overall, as we'll do in the one to come, then after that, as I'd said, the better part of all of this is just exploring different passages that are judged to have some kind of messianic vision associated. casting a vision for Israel in the future, casting a vision for restoration of Jews, casting a vision for the ultimate restorer who will make all things good, and that is the Messiah. It's interesting, it seems to me, the nature of the relationship between the Messiah and the Jews is amply underscored. This is a little bit of a rabbit, a little parenthetical, but if you can recall in Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, the disciples, after Yeshua is dead, buried, resurrected, and everything, just before he takes off, they ask him, they say, well, hey, listen, boss, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel now? We get the whole dying on the cross for sins, but what about Israel? And Jesus didn't say, oh, no, you got it all wrong. It's all about the church now. Forget the Jews. He said, listen, it's not for you to know when, because God has set those times and he's fixed it by his own authority. But I want you to focus your energies on being my witnesses unto me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the othermost parts of the world. But there's this lingering issue. What about Israel? What about Jews? So I want to kind of bring that together a little bit, because when we look at Isaiah, I'm interested in Isaiah prophecies about the ultimate restorer, that is the Messiah, the restoration persona that he brings to people individually. But similarly, in conjunction with that, I want to explore passages that presage the rejuvenation that comes to the Jewish people and to the world in conjunction with his coming, both first and second. So I say I want to look and explore different ways that Isaiah is adjudged to speak to, for, and about the coming of the Messiah. Now, by means of all of this little sampler mini course, my hope is that you will become better acquainted with the book of Isaiah. That's really important, to become better acquainted with the literature. And the gospel according to Isaiah spelled out therein. And that is very important to me. And as a result, then, hopefully, you will be the better able to then be a minister of the life-giving word in the book. At the end of the day, that's the name of the game. Before you get the story out, you got to get the story straight. But, I really want you to practice getting the story out. And if you'll permit a little chiding in that regard, in Bible colleges and seminaries today, people go through programs and then they go become licensed as reverends and rabbis, Messianic rabbis. But a lot of times these boards that certify these leaders never ask if they've ever led anybody to Jesus, or if they've ever even had a conversation with anyone about Jesus outside of tendering their reflections in a Sunday school class or speaking behind a pulpit somewhere. There are many people that have never even tried to have a conversation with a human being about Yeshua, and now they're reverends of the gospel. To me, frankly, at the risk of sounding overly negative, I think that's tragic. I think there's something wrong with that. And that is, if the only conversations we even try and offer the world about Jesus are conversations we have when we have a lectern, I think we're woefully deficient in the way that we're thinking and the way that we're oriented. Let me tell you, there are miracles to behold if you would just, in the context of talking to people around water coolers at work and break rooms, conversations with friends, neighbors, co-workers, the extent to which you have an opportunity, or to the extent to which you make an opportunity. People say, well, Lord, I just wish you'd give me an opportunity. Look, maybe the Lord would wish you would make an opportunity to be proactive. It's like saying, Lord, I wish you'd provide me for a job. Okay, well, go out and look for one too and see what works through the expenditure of energy. By all means, please go out of your way. If you really want to learn Isaiah, just open it up and share it with Jewish people and see how the Lord works through it. Well, you're going to see that, particularly when we explore Isaiah 53. I have 2 sessions for that. But that and the rest of all that is coming later as we work through the gospel according to Isaiah.